Hey, we're live. We're here. What's going on, everybody? We've got a great grade school session that we're going to be diving into today. We're going to be talking about how we can use cinematography and the lessons of cinematography and travel those into the color grading suite and really create a fluid connection between the different phases of production. And I've got some ideas that I'm excited to share with you guys on this, and I'm excited to hear y'all's questions on this subject as well. So get your topics or your questions ready, and we're going to talk about these things for a couple minutes leading up to that. How is everybody? I'm glad to see you all today, or at least see who's in the chat. What's going on? There we go. Right before we went live, I was like, gosh, it's kind of quiet in the chat. I feel like that's half the fun of grade school is the chat's always really lively, but I see it's getting lively fast. All right, Thatcher's here, Brett's here. Oh, Darren's here. I'm just going to sit down. You guys can run this, right? Oh, Hafiz is here. Awesome. Good to see everybody. I got my coffee back, guys. I'm feeling good. I'm back in my flow, back in my rhythm, for those who care about such things at all. What's new with you guys? What have you been up to? I'm still getting settled into my new nest, my new cave, whatever you want to call it. I'm a cave creature, as most of us are by nature. So glad to be getting settled in here, and all is good over here in the Kelly Casa. I'm still coming to you guys from our new home that we just moved to. Still got my office, but cool to be able to do grade school sessions from home as well. And fired up to dive into today's topic. So let's get into it. Let's riff for a little bit. Rolf, what's going on, buddy? How are you?
Hello, it's been a while since I've been here, so I feel kind of like a newbie here. But I've been shooting, essentially. I've been kind of outside of the color grading world, but I've been shooting. And the best thing about shooting yourself is that you can color grade whatever you like, essentially. You don't have to respond to your client's needs. So that's been pretty fun. And yeah, that's essentially what I've been doing.
Yeah, and I'm sure you end up learning quite a bit from shooting that you can bring into the grading process, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like being a colorist and then a cinematographer rather than the opposite, you already know what you can bring back in post, essentially. It's not like you don't have any surprise, so that's very nice.
Yeah, yeah, and it's all one beautiful fluid thing, guys. Like that's one of my biggest ideas that I'm excited about sharing and communicating is that, like we have these harsh divides between the phases of production, especially between production and post, but they're really all just one thing, and there's no reason they need to be disconnected, unrelated, uncommunicative, and non-benefiting from one another. We can really have them be connected and fluid. We're going to be talking about that for today's session, and actually for one other session coming up soon as well. We'll take things from the opposite perspective, how you can apply the lessons of color grading in the world of cinematography as well. So I'm excited for that one. But today we are talking about how we can apply the lessons of cinematography, how we can essentially grade like a cinematographer. So let's get into it. I've got some ideas I want to share with you guys. I'm going to run through these with y'all. Get your questions ready. You can drop questions in the chat as we go along. If I say something and you're like, wait, what the hell are you talking about? And we'll have time to answer your questions and talk about any other topics that are top of mind in this area in just a couple minutes. So let's dive in. So I want to give you guys 3 ideas today about how to shoot like a cinematographer, okay? How to grade like a cinematographer, how to think like a cinematographer. Here's the first one. This might not be what you think. I think a lot of you guys probably know that at some point we're going to be talking about thinking photographically, and we will, but it's going to be with a little bit of a twist. It might not be what you're expecting, and that's not where we're going to start. We're going to start somewhere slightly different. Something that I have learned as a professional colorist, working with lots and lots of different cinematographers and sitting in lots and lots of different rooms and working on lots of different projects, is to respect prior context. So as you guys know, I'm such a big proponent here on the channel about like sending out cinematographers with a LUT that actually represents their creative intent, saying, hey, let's build you a custom LUT, or let's set you up with a LUT that reflects your creative intent, so that when you're gathering your images, you're actually seeing a rendering of those images that's meaningful and relevant to what you're trying to do, and not just something stock or off the shelf. But the opposite is true as well. Whether you took my advice fully, whether you kind of took my advice and you're like, well, at least I've got a maybe slightly higher contrast LUT than a stock manufacturer LUT, and that is closer to my creative intent, so I'm going to use that. Or you went the full length and designed a show LUT with your colorist. Whatever the case may be, you're a cinematographer when we sit down to color grade. And again, whether you're like Rolf and you are the cinematographer yourself, or you're working with a cinematographer, as I more commonly do, you're going to be sitting down with someone who has a prior context for that image. So let me give you guys an example of this. Let's look at Resolve here. Let's see if I can find my way. Okay. Let me know if you guys can see my Resolve. Okay, you should be able to. I got my Stream Deck back in play. It's like working again, and the whole home grading setup is. I've been doing more grading from home since we moved than I had been for a little while, so that's exciting too. But anyway, I digress. So let's take a look at this frame, for example, and I'll try to make it a little bit bigger for us. So let's take a look at, like we've got a couple frames from one movie here, and right now I've done no grading whatsoever. I just got my color management set up, and I've put together what I think is a really nice imaging pipeline. I've got my output transform, and then I've got my look that's being provided by my look development plugin Contour right here, okay? So I might look at this and feel like, oh, wow, this is really groovy. This is a great direction for the film. This might even align with the creative direction that I have gotten from the creatives in anticipation of our first sessions sitting together, looking at the images. But what I'm not doing right now is respecting prior context, or at least being aware of prior context. What I'm showing right now is going to have a relationship to what the cinematographer and the production creative saw on set. And it's important for me as the colorist to understand, what were you actually looking at? Regardless of the guidance that I would give you, the advice that I would give you before production, like, oh, shoot under a LUT that represents your creative intent, all those points that we've talked about before. What did you actually shoot under? What was the actual case when you were grabbing these images? Because if it was, for example, the camera manufacturer LUT, take a look at the difference between what I've just cooked up here and the camera manufacturer LUT. So here's the camera manufacturer LUT, okay? That's a big difference. And if this is what you were looking at when you shot, it's what you've been looking at as you go through the editorial process, believe it or not, no matter how good I do, no matter how tasty and beautiful of an image I cook up in terms of an overall look, you're probably not going to accept it very readily. It's going to feel foreign. It's going to feel weird to you, right? Because this is your context, your prior context, right? So that's really the point I want to emphasize here in this first of our couple talking points here, is we have to respect prior context. So part of that involves asking questions of like, hey, what did you shoot for? Part of that involves just like looking at an offline reference that has the LUT that was used on set and used in the edit applied, so that you can see what that looks like and at least approximate it. Because I may still want to guide this image to this place, but when I talk about respecting prior context means I understand, even if I want to guide the image to this place, I got to start here. I got to start somewhere familiar and then slowly work things into that new direction in order for it to feel collaborative and in order for it to feel like there's some context and it's not like a disorienting, overwhelming experience for the people who actually gathered these images and who've been looking at them in a particular way long before I became involved in the project, or before I became at least actively involved in the project, right? So that's number one, respect prior context. Like I said, part of that involves asking the right questions. What did you shoot under? Part of that involves looking at the offline reference that you were provided. What does the offline reference look like? What have they been looking at during the post-production process up until this point? The other part of it, though, involves some practical, technical know-how here inside of Resolve. So let's just talk through what I'm doing here for a second. I've actually got a mislabeled node here that I'm going to correctly label before we begin. But essentially, let's go back to where I was a moment ago. So within here, I've got my overall color management set up here. I've got my input transform from camera into DaVinci Wide Gamut, right? I don't have any grading going on whatsoever. Nothing happening at the clip level. Nothing happening at the group post-clip level. By the way, I'm going kind of fast through my color management process here. If you want to do a deeper dive or get more context for what all I'm doing here and why, we've got dedicated videos on that here on the channel. But for now, I'm going to kind of keep going at this pace. Here at the timeline level is where I have my output transform and my look being applied. So I've got my look coming here from Contour, and then I'm actually using an output transform called 2499, or a DRT, we sometimes call it, called 2499, made by a very talented member of our community, a dude named JP. JP joins us sometimes in grade school, don't you? Are you here today, JP? Can I put you on blast? No. Okay, well, he's with us in spirit. JP's got some game. Anyway, so that's my pipeline that I've got in place for today, right? So what I need to do is I want to show what this image looked like through the stock camera LUT, or through the stock manufacturer LUT. but I don't really want to tear down my entire color management in the process, right? Or I may even actually want to grade through that manufacturer LUT. I do that all the time actually with Aries Reveal LUT for the Alexa 35, but we'll get to that in a minute. So if I've got this all set up here and I'm grading in DaVinci Wide Gamut, maybe I've even begun to do some grading here at the clip level, but regardless, I don't want to have to tear down my color management in order to look at this alternate view of the image or this more relevant view. So the other option that we can do here, let's just grab this as a still and we're going to build our new pipeline from scratch here. We're just going to use a color space transform. So I've already gone here at my group pre-clip level from Arri Wide Gamut 3 log C3 to DaVinci Wide Gamut DaVinci Intermediate, right? I'm going to tap on node number 1 here and hit Command C. Now we're going to go to the timeline level, tap on node number 1 again and hit Command V to paste, okay? Now, that's not going to do much of anything useful right now. That's essentially applying another instance of the same transform, which is wrong, right? Because I'm not in Arri Wide Gamut 3. I don't want to go to DaVinci Wide Gamut. In fact, I'm already in DaVinci Wide Gamut, right? But there's this feature that they introduced, and I think in like Resolve 18.5 that I love, where we can just swap these two. So now I'm going right back into my original camera color space. And just to prove this to you, let's disable this node, let's disable this node, and let's grab a still. So this is my camera log untouched, unmodified image. Let's turn this node back on in my group pre-clip, and let's turn this node back on that we've just created. Let's go ahead and label it correctly. We'll say this is 2 log C3. And let's compare, let's wipe. So we're identical, right? Never mind the black bars, those aren't going to be in the final image regardless. But if we look at the actual image, it's identical. So we've performed a net zero round trip, right? Which is exactly what we want because I want to feed that original camera state into the manufacturer's LUT. I have that living here in my LUT folder, Arri log C Wide Gamut full to Rec 1886, Rec 709 full. And I'm going to apply that here, okay? So if this production was shooting through this LUT, this is what they would have seen. And by the way, this production actually did shoot with this LUT. When we actually did this grade, this was a thing that I needed to be mindful of because regardless of where we want to go, I want to start somewhere familiar so it doesn't feel like I'm immediately taking you into some strange, unfamiliar place with your own images, right? So this is a way that we can maintain our color management while still previewing or even doing our final rendering of our image through the output transform that was used when the images were gathered. Does that make sense? That's kind of a lot. It can feel complex at first, but this is something, as I said, I actually use all the time. I use it so much, in fact, that I have a preset saved for it, not for this output transform, for this K1S1, which is sometimes what the log C3 to Rec 709 manufacturer LUT is called, but I do have one for the Arri Reveal LUT, which is their log C4 to Rec 709 or log C4 to display viewing transform. And you can see I've got that pulled up right over here in my outputs. So if I just middle click on my DaVinci Wide Gamut to 709 Reveal, now I'm going to be rendering things through that pipeline. And like I said, this can be a still that I save in my gallery and keep handy in case I want to reference to it and show the client what they did look at when they shot the image. This can even be the foundation of what I'm going to do, and then I can do, for example, I can use Contour, my look plugin, up here while I'm still in DaVinci Wide Gamut before I go into camera original space. So I can go in here, I'm just going to import a profile into the plugin. And now I've got that same look that we were looking at before, but it's going through a different output transform, okay? So I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you guys here, but the main point, as I said, is that we want to respect prior context, and that involves asking the right questions, looking at the offline reference, as well as having the technical know-how to tee up that prior context for the client, and then either to slowly move away from that, or to actually use that as your pipeline and then develop your look within that, all right? Okay. Number 2, this is a slippery one, but it's a really cool one. It's a really important one. Any adjustment that we are going to make when we are mastering a motion image, when we are taking an image from its original camera log state and into its final rendered, beautiful display ready state, any adjustment that falls within that process can kind of be described or placed into 2 different buckets, okay? The first bucket is about the scene, or about the camera. That would be things like, I want to change the exposure of this image. I want to stop things down. That could even be things like, I want to darken that corner of the room. I wish I'd had time to put up a flag on set, but I didn't. So I'm going to darken that corner of the room in post. That's bucket number one, is things that are about the scene or about the camera. Bucket number two is different. Bucket number two is about the image or about the rendering of the image. It's a slippery distinction, but the distinction that I'm trying to make is that there's a certain point in the flow of a color grading pipeline. We can actually kind of look at it here in this process. Right now we've got a new pipeline that we've just set up, right? We've got a look here, and then we've got an output transform. So we've kind of got our pipeline in place. And if we look at the way that we might begin to do our color grading here, I'm going to go over to my HDR tab, and this is where I will do my exposure adjustments. That's a very scene or camera oriented adjustment. And then from there, I'm going to pass forward. I'm using my, essentially kind of manually building out my template node graph right now. And I'm going to go into my gain and work my linear gain. This is, again, fundamentally a camera or a scene thing. It's ratios of red, green, and blue in a scene linear state, right? So far we're working in a very camera or scene driven context. And we may continue to do so, like back here in node number one, if we now want to adjust our contrast ratio and we're just doing a simple like lift and gain, or maybe we're in linear and we are adjusting our gamma like so. These are like very scene oriented ways of adjusting contrast, exposure, color balance, things like this. But what happens is the deeper I go into this node tree and into my grading process, I'm going to start to make more and more finessed adjustments that have less and less to do with the scene or with the camera, okay? So just one example of that might be, I don't know, let me go to one of my presets here. I've got a preset for a manipulation that I use called a volume curve sometimes. So right now this volume curve has its key output gain set to 0, so nothing's happening. And if I go to my custom curves, you can see the shape of this. Let me make this image a little bit bigger for you guys. Let's also go to something a little bit tighter just to make it easier to see. And if I now go to my key output gain, you can see this is the shape of my curve, okay? If I go to my key output gain, I'm now going to start to boost that up, like so. And if I go off and essentially like, let's zoom in on her face and we can kind of see what I'm getting up to here. Off and then on. I'm just kind of like, I don't know, like thickening up the image, adding volume into the low end of the image in a preferential way that really has nothing to do with the scene, or has very little to do with the scene or the camera. This isn't something that I can really think of in terms of a camera or in terms of the original scene. Like there's nothing that I could do to really realize this effect in camera or in my lighting. It's got more to do with the way the image is being rendered, okay? And it's going to continue to get more and more this way as I pass forward into my pipeline. By the time I'm here, like doing my creative look, this has basically nothing to do with the scene or the camera. This is just my preferred rendering of an image. We can think about this like in the context of a film print. A film print and the way that a film print renders the original scene colors has nothing to do with the scene fundamentally. I suppose I can't say nothing because it does relate in some way enough that when we see the final image, we're like, oh, I recognize that's a person, that's a boat, that's a fire truck, whatever it might be. But fundamentally, there's not a one-to-one relationship. It's not about manipulating the scene or about the camera. It's about manipulating the rendering in order to get the desired feel in our image. Does that make sense? That took me a minute to explain, but I really want to try to delineate a slippery difference. Is what I'm doing about the scene or the camera, or is it about the rendering or the image or the feeling of the image? Okay? The reason I emphasize these two buckets is this. We can ask ourselves for any adjustment that we're making, is this about the scene? And when I keep talking about the scene or about the camera, this is really just another way of talking about a point that I emphasize in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. Thinking photographically, right? How can we think about this image photographically, and how can we manipulate this image in a photographic manner, okay? That's bucket number one. That is a great place to start because photographic adjustments are going to be simple, they're going to be clean, they're going to be intuitive, they're going to be fast, and they're going to travel really nicely from one shot to another. If I'm making, say, an exposure adjustment to trim a half a stop off of my exposure here, that's going to travel really well, that's nice and clean. If I want to trim exposure in a way that is true to camera or to scene, this is really the only way to do it. There might be different ways to do the exact same mathematical operation inside of Resolve, but applying linear gain in powers of 2, which is what's happening if you want to get geeky under the hood here, is really the only true way to adjust exposure in the sense of, in a photographic sense, unless you're just using exposure as a catch-all description for a darker or brighter image. So I think it's helpful to delineate between like, oh, do I just want a creatively brighter or darker image, or am I adjusting exposure, for example? Okay, so big theme here to take away. What operation, or rather which bucket does the operation I'm trying to perform fall into? Is this more about the scene or the camera, or is this more about the image or the rendering? As I said, one easy way to sort of delineate between those two is to try and think about, like, all right, what am I wanting to see here? And could that be conceived of as something that would happen in the scene or in the camera? Darkening the image is an easy one. Like, sure, I could think of that as an exposure adjustment. Windowing an area of the image, this also could be something I could think of as a scene adjustment, right? So if I look at, going flat here, and I could say like, well, we used a less reflective material for this actual floor in the art direction, or we were able to control the light so that less of it was bouncing onto the floor. Like maybe we know that we're always going to get these overheads kicking down onto the floor, but who knows what other light sources are hitting the floor right now. So maybe we were able to control that somewhat, but I'm thinking about this as more of a photographic adjustment, right? I'm going to flip my gamma to linear here, and we're just going to stop this down like so. Oops, I'm working my HDR palette, which is not what I want to do. Let's do that. Okay, so this would be an example of conceiving of something that I want to do in a more photographic manner. There's going to be other instances, like actually this little volume adjustment that we made a moment ago is a pretty good example, where I'm like, all right, I want to see something. So like, let's go back into this tight chuck. It's going to be a little bit easier to see, or maybe over to this one. This is good. So I'm going to reset my first node here. We can reset this, and we might look at this image after kind of setting our initial exposure and everything and say like, all right, I want to see something. I want to see more snap. I want to see more richness in the shadows maybe. And I might go in and be like, all right, well, let's try working some lift and gain, or even some gamma and some gain, and be like, yeah, that's just not doing it for me. That's not quite what I want to see. So instead, I might look at doing something like this volume adjustment, which, as I said, is no longer about the scene. I'm not looking at adjusting the contrast ratio in any kind of like linear or scene motivated way. I'm just looking at shaping the way the pixels arrive on the screen. Does that make sense? It can be really helpful to delineate between those two things. And if you're making photographic adjustments that don't feel good, it might be time to move on to making a more image or rendering driven approach to your process, whatever you're trying to do. So this is not about one being right or you needing to like discover what the nature of what you're doing is. It's more about asking the question so that you can answer for yourself. Like, what do I want to see? Do I want to piggyback off of the work of the cinematographer, or do I want to contribute my work in the color grading arena of controlling the way this image is rendered? Okay, hope that makes sense. Okay, one more that I want to talk you guys through, and then we can take a break here. So here's another big one. We talk a lot as colorists and in the color grading sphere about supporting the vision of the production creatives, especially the cinematographer, right? It's a big part of what I do as a professional colorist. We talk about it a lot, and with good reason, because that's really where it all begins, is we need to enter in as guides and collaborators to our production counterparts to help them realize the image that they envisioned from the very beginning of the process, right? That's something that has certainly served me well in my career, but there's another dimension to this that I don't think gets discussed as much. Yes, we want to support the vision of the cinematographer and the director, whomever else on the production side. We want to support their vision for sure. But our other role as the colorist is to support the image. This is something I'm going to pop out of my fun little bubble. By the way, do you guys like my little circle bubble thing that we came up with here in OBS? I'm very inordinately happy about this, probably because it took me way too long to figure out. But this one, there's less of a practical counterpart inside of Resolve for me to show you, and this is more of a theme or an idea I want to share, that when we're color grading, it is not simply our job to be the genie who or who's the person who conjures the genie out of the lamp. That's not a dedicated person. We're not meant to be the person who rubs the lamp and gets the genie out of realizing the vision of the production creative, at least not solely. That's part of what we do, is conjuring that genie. But the other thing that we do is we are able, because we didn't shoot the image, because we weren't there for the day of the shoot, we haven't been living with this image for weeks and months, we're able to look at the image and see it for what it is. Not for what they meant it to be, not for what they wish it could have been, but we're able to actually look at the image and see it for what it is. See its strengths, see its weaknesses, and help to guide it into the best form of itself. So this is another thing that I've learned from thinking about the cinematography and the production process that came before I ever got involved as the colorist, is looking at the image through that lens of like, what does the image want? Not just what do the creatives want. Of course, we have to negotiate that difference if there is indeed a difference, if they got a different image than they intended, or if the image has different properties than they wish it did. That's a conversation, that's a collaboration, that's something we have to figure out. But it's a huge part of what we can bring to the table as motion imaging creatives in the post-production sphere, is the ability to simply look at an image and be like, wow, I think this is really strong in the following ways. I don't think it's as strong in maybe the ways that you wanted or the ways that you had hoped it to be. And I want to help to guide the image into the best form of itself, not just follow your directions and try to give you, an image that looks identical to a reference that you've brought in or a reference that you had in mind when you captured the image. Does that make sense? That's the third one, is that we want to support not only the vision of the creatives, but we want to support the image itself. And that involves developing the ability to look at an image, to see it for what it is, to see its strengths and weaknesses, and to guide it into its best form for it, not just to blindly follow the direction that we might be getting from the people who we're working with. So that's some initial ideas I wanted to share with you guys about how we can bring cinematography and the lessons of cinematography into the color grading process, and how we can apply those to the way that we approach things when we're color grading. Does anyone have questions about that or other topics they want to discuss in this area?
We have a few questions. We have a question about Film Look Creator or any kind of plugin replacing lookup tables. Is that a thing that you think is going to happen, or is happening right now, that plugins are more useful than regular lookup tables?
Oh, this is a great question. So yeah, are plugins more useful than lookup tables? I would say it depends on what you're trying to do. I think in general, like there's a notion out there that part of the beef that comes up with LUTs a lot, and part of like the dislike of LUTs that exists out there, has to do with some misunderstandings of the way LUTs work, and about like sampling error essentially is a big thing that people are talking about, even if they don't know that they're talking about it, where the arguments will often come in the form of like LUTs break things, or LUTs are inaccurate, things along those lines. Really, where most of that those talking points are coming from is from the idea that LUTs work by interpolating, right? So LUTs are a number of known points, and most of the pixels in your image are actually going to fall between those points. So what do we do when we're applying a LUT to an image whose pixel does not rest perfectly on a sample for that LUT? We guess, fundamentally. We estimate, or we interpolate, right? That is often seen as a downside that I actually don't really see as a downside inherently in and of itself. So can plugins replace LUTs, or are they going to be better than LUTs? In that regard, I would say no. By the way, the reason I bring that up right now is because plugins actually don't operate in the same way. Plugins, I mean, a plugin could be applying a LUT under the hood, but more commonly, a LUT is actually going to be applying a per pixel manipulation. So in that sense, it's more precise and more accurate to what the original intent of the manipulation was. That's not significant to me, though. I don't think that's an actual measurable, tangible benefit. However, there's other benefits, okay? So like some of you guys may have heard me tell this story before, that like the thing that got me sort of like going down the rabbit hole of creative color science and building tools and building plugins and all that stuff was the desire to get inside of a LUT. Because I would look at, like if we pull this out and we replace it with, I don't know, like let's look at my 2383, for example. This is a free download, by the way, for anyone who doesn't already have this LUT. This is a free download that you can grab. And to make this more meaningful, let's wipe all this out and let's render this not through that camera manufacturer LUT, but through a normal Resolve color management scenario. And then I'm going to apply this 2383. Okay. So one of my big sort of like itches that I was trying to scratch when I first started getting into creative color science and tool development and all that stuff is I'm like, yeah, well, like I like this. This is cool. This is doing interesting things, but I want to like get in there. I want to control the parameters. I want to know what the parameters and the properties of it are. I want to be able to individually manipulate them, pull them apart, understand what's happening in here. That's something that a LUT is lousy at doing. LUTs are amazing at capturing creative intent and rendering and stabilizing it, whether you're applying one in camera or in Resolve or in a Baselight or in any other scenario. The LUT's going to apply the same way every time. And that's a really powerful thing that is not guaranteed by many other processes and tools in the post-production and production sphere. That's all positive. What's not positive is by that same sort of logic, LUTs are just a self-contained black box that are very reliable. They always do the same thing. And there's really no way to get in there and mess them up or tune them or change what they're doing. You can kind of do that in ways that we've talked about here on the channel before, but fundamentally they're a black box that you can't get inside of. So that is both a good and a bad thing depending on what you're trying to do. Same thing goes with plugins. Plugins, like my plugin Contour that we were looking at here a moment ago. Let's go back to Resolve Color Management. Let's look at Contour again. This is really fun for being able to dynamically, fluidly introduce a look into an image. And what's fun here, and this is a thing you can do with probably more than one with plugins in addition to Contour, but I've actually got these presets that I can pull in and I instantly get a vibe, a feeling, kind of like with a LUT, but I actually have access to all the parameters and variables that are going into that. So if I want to use this as a baseline, which by the way I do all the time, I've loaded this FP1 in several times already today, because this is often a baseline that I'll start with for my projects, and then I'll just go in and tune it as the individual projects actually need, right? So that's super cool, like a plugin that allows you to manipulate and tune and refine what you're doing on the basis of a particular project, based on the needs of a particular project. That's super cool. The challenge comes with this plugin, like I happened to see a user asking about this for Contour this morning, where they're like, oh, I just updated to the newest version of Contour, but I have an old project from 3 months ago that I need to dig out, and I want to make sure that the plugin is going to render things the same in this version as it did in the prior version. We actually make pains within the plugin to make sure that's the case, and to make big announcements and point release, like numerical indicators to say like, hey, between these two versions, that won't be the case. You actually won't get the same rendering. But in general, we take big pains to make sure that is the case. But with a LUT, you don't have to worry about that ever. LUTs don't have version updates. LUTs aren't going to do a software update in the background. Plugins do. Whether it's this plugin or any other plugin, they can change and the rendering of them can change. So the same flexibility that we talked about liking can also lead to some instability that is less desirable. So I would say like the plugins versus LUTs thing, I think there's definitely room and necessity for both. I'll leave it with this too. When we do color grading projects here at Cullen Kelly Color, and I build looks in Contour, which is the way I build looks for all the projects that we grade here, one of the first things that we do is cook out a LUT with every revision that we do, for the exact reasons that I'm talking about, because I want to have a stable, unchangeable, captured essence of what we were doing, so that I can refer back to it at any point, even if the plugin, like completely explodes or goes crazy or whatever it might be, or if we need to load it into a system that doesn't have the plugin installed. That's the other thing, is LUTs can be applied almost anywhere, and plugins have to be installed and licensed and managed and all that stuff. So hope that's some helpful ideas there, probably more than we needed to talk about plugins versus LUTs, but I love talking about this stuff. What else we got?
Question from Noir Grade, and he wants to know how to convince the DP that the lookup table they desperately want to use is actually technically bad. Perhaps doesn't preserve exposure, perhaps doesn't fit in an HDR workflow. So also we could talk also about how to assist your DP before the shooting begins.
Oh yeah, this is some great stuff to talk about. So let's start with the first topic. How do we talk to a DP about a LUT that they are in love with that we have concerns about, right? This is one that has come up for me a lot. But fundamentally, I think what we need to do is make it tangible and make it visual, because we're all visual creatures. That's the biggest, most guaranteed way that we're going to be able to connect and agree on stuff, colorist versus cinematographer versus director versus producer for that matter. Pretty much anybody who's in the business of making motion images is visual in some respect, right? So if you have a LUT that is not ideal for the grade that you're trying to perform, or it's causing problems, show them. Like, I would pull it up and be like, hey, I want to show you something. Look what happens, like whatever it might be. Look what happens if we decide we want to saturate this color of cyan to this extent or further. Watch how the LUT responds to that. See how that breaks? And you know, like, that's actually a good example. Let's go with that for a second. This can also be a scenario where, like, I'm a big fan of offering options as opposed to prescribing what we definitively must do. So even though I might not want to grade under that LUT that the DP dragged in that's got all these problems with it, I don't want to grade under that for like 20 different reasons. But unless it's just egregious and I'm like, we are guaranteed going to have problems and it's going to do harm to your image, unless it's in that category, I will usually offer up the option and say like, hey, let me show you like the number one thing or the top 3 things that are really concerning about this LUT and the practical visual problems that it can cause and may cause during our grading process. Let me actually show these to you. And once I've shown them, we can say like, all right, it's up to you. Like, if you really want to grade under this LUT and we just need to like work around these problems when they pop up, like, we can do that. But I want you to be aware of these problems. And then of course the companion idea here is that we want to be able to offer an alternative. So something that I do all the time, again with my look development plugin Contour, and which I've certainly even done prior to Contour with just not as much speed, is like, all right, let's talk about what you like about that LUT and let's just rebuild it more cleanly. That's something that, again, I will offer up not as like, hey, we have to do this, or I refuse to use this LUT. I'll say like, well, maybe we'll start with like, let me show you a couple of issues that I see as potential problems with this LUT. Or I'll say, hey, can we spend 10 minutes looking at some riffs on what I see working well in that LUT that I've prepared for you from scratch, that I have full control over, and that are not going to cause any problems to any of the frames. Let me just show you some things. If you don't like these, or if you want to see something change in them, we can talk about that. But let me just explore some of these things with you. That's another big part of it, is like, I feel like, you know, to put a bow on this first point, it's like, it's all good and well that we as a colorist recognize that a LUT is less than ideal and we, for a variety of reasons, don't want to use it, but we want to offer an explanation, or we want to offer like proof of what we're saying, and we want to offer good alternatives. If we don't do that, then it kind of is a lot to ask of the DP to say like, oh, this LUT that you've been using, I don't like it as your colorist. I'm not really going to show you why it's a problem. I'm just going to say it's a problem, and then I'm going to ask you to trust me that I'm going to get your image looking just as good as you were seeing before on my own, using my own tools, and I'm not even going to show that to you before we decide to proceed down that road. So we kind of want to prove things out, prove that the LUT has a problem, and prove that we can capture the things that we like about the LUT by other means, right? And Raf, remind me, what was the second point we wanted to talk about? How to set things up for success with the DP?
Yeah, essentially, if you could bring something like your middle exposure tool, something to assist them while shooting.
Yeah. So that's a great thing to bring up as well. So that's definitely a good option. And the first thing that occurs to mind for me is like, all right, how can we set up our production counterparts for success ahead of time, before they've shot? To me, the two biggest things, and we will end up talking about this probably in another episode of Grade School coming up soon, the two biggest things are, number one, to use what I call a high context viewing transform. That's a really fancy term for a LUT that does what you are going to want to do in the grade. Like, that's all it really is, but it's a handy way of expressing it, and it's amazing how foreign a concept that can be. It's like, if the LUT isn't doing what you want it to do in the grade, you're basically depriving yourself of your most valuable tool. your eyes, right? I'm talking about the cinematographer now. If your LUT isn't doing what you're going to want to see in the grade, then what you're seeing on the camera really doesn't mean much, right? Like you can generally assess like, oh, did I remember to put the person in the frame? And did I remember to light them so that the exposure is not just a black frame? But cinematography, as most of us know, is incredibly nuanced. Like there's so much detail, so much work that goes into it. They're under so much time pressure and so much budget constraint. They never have the rig they need or all the lighting that they wanted or all the time that they needed to shoot that scene or the location that they wanted to shoot the scene in. There's so much constraint and pressure that like every possible edge you can give yourself, you definitely should be. And one of the biggest edges that you can give yourself and one of the most beneficial, one of the easiest ones you can give yourself is to shoot through a LUT that actually represents what you want to see. So we could take that same example that we looked at a minute ago, or at the beginning of our session, I should say, of like, all right, you were shooting through this. Now let's again look at a face because I feel like faces really help tell the tale a little bit more. Like, all right, you were shooting through this. And like, imagine how different your choices would be, even if I don't do anything else but add a creative look. Use the same exact pipeline, but just add a creative look that's going to introduce a good bit more contrast. Your choices are going to be different through this rendering than that rendering, right? How could they possibly not be? You're going to make different choices about your contrast ratio. You're going to make different choices about the color temperature of your bulbs. And you're generally going to be more dialed into the negative that's actually going to help you get to the final image that you're seeking. So that's number one. Use the high context viewing transform, right? And then number two would absolutely be to use an exposure tool that you can trust and that is stable for whatever camera format you're using. So I'll give you guys a quick preview of a tool that I released last year called Sweet Spot that does exactly that. Sweet Spot is essentially false color that works. So false color drives me crazy, and it is more importantly than how it makes me feel, because I'm not a shooter, it drives many cinematographers crazy, including some of the best cinematographers in the game. My friend Seamus McGarvey, ASC, was one of the ones who first described to me that like the idea of going image blind from a false color overlays. Like you turn on that false color and like I can't even see the image. Once it goes back off, I can't even see the image for like 30 seconds to a minute because I've been completely blinded by like that disco overlay of all those different colors. So the idea with Sweet Spot is it tells you far less and it only tells you what you need to know, and it doesn't tell it to you in this obnoxious and sort of image blindness producing way. So Sweet Spot, like for this image, if I turn off my color management for a moment, this is Sweet Spot. It's set up per camera. This is Sweet Spot for Log C3. So we can actually see here is what is hitting middle gray of this camera sensor. If I don't adjust any exposure or any other, make any other adjustment here, this is what the DP would have seen if they had applied this LUT, which by the way, that's how Sweet Spot ships. It's just as a LUT. This is how they would have, what they would have seen if they had applied it in camera. And it makes it really easy to assess, like, let's just pretend that over here, this isn't a color correction manipulation, but it's actually an exposure adjustment. It makes it really easy to adjust exposure and ratio. Because if you were sitting here, you'd be like, wow, there's really not much of my subject sitting in the sweet spot of the sensor. It doesn't matter that I might even want to print the image down to this point. Generally speaking, it's going to be best to park as much of your subject in this zone as you can. Okay, so if you just were to kind of ride your exposure, you might end up with something like this. And you might then look at it and say, well, I'm actually getting more of my fill side in there than I want to. And that's where you would start looking at controlling your ratio and bringing in some negative fill or whatever might be needed to produce that effect. But that's the idea there, is this is really just telling you one thing. It's not telling you what are all the individual zones of my image and am I parking everything perfectly into each of them. I think that's complete nonsense. I think protecting highlights is very overblown, and I certainly think like, oh, I need to make sure that every ingredient in this frame is parked within a particular zone. That's a crazy premise to me, and it's a crazy premise to many of my favorite cinematographers. Really all you need to do is you need to have a LUT that shows what you're going to want to do in the grade, and you need to have something that is objectively showing you the one zone that matters, which is the zone right around the sweet spot of your camera sensor. So those would be my two initial answers to like, how can we set up cinematographers and production counterparts for success and tee them up for success. Build a LUT for them, and then set them up. Make sure they're making good exposure decisions, whether that's with Sweet Spot or whether it's by some other means. Support them in making good exposure decisions, and this is where what we learn as colorists and what we understand as colorists about camera sensors and the way that exposure happens is something that we can share with our production counterparts and help them to make better decisions with. Hope that helps.
Question about the order of operations when doing look development. Is contrast something that you do before or after split toning? And perhaps we can talk about contour and why it has the order of operation that it has.
Sure. Yeah. So order of operations for look development. So let's go back to 2499 for my rendering here, and let's turn our color management back on over here. Yeah. So it's funny if we talk about on basic order of ops, like do you do your split before or after your contrast curve? Here would be the thing that I always try to remind myself of that is helpful for us all to remember. I'm going to go on a bit of a brief tangent here for a second. There was kind of this light bulb that went off for me not that long ago when as I've been having a renewed interest in understanding film and film rendering. The way that we get split toning in a film system, we're going to create a splitter combiner here for a second, okay? I'm going to do this by hitting Option Y. For anyone who doesn't know, a splitter combiner simply splits our image into the red, green, and blue channels. We talked about this a little bit in our last episode of Grade School where we were doing our deep dive on nodes, right? So what's interesting is that in film, the split tone that we get, or that so-called tinting of neutrals where shadows might become cool and highlights might become warm, it's really just a matter of the speed of the layers and the fact that they're not all perfectly the same speed or the same contrast effectively. So one way to get split toning, and this is a quite filmic way to get split toning, is I'm just going to run a grayscale ramp through this so you guys can actually see what I'm talking about. And I'm going to go back to my primaries here. I'm going to go to my contrast pivot. So check this out. If I apply some contrast to my red channel and to my green channel and maybe to my blue as well, look what I'm getting. I'm getting effectively a split tone scheme, right? So it's not the most intuitive to control. I wouldn't hold your breath for this to be a new interface for split toning within Contour, for example, because I don't find it has a very intuitive relationship to what I'm trying to get out of the split tone scheme. I'm looking for particular results, not for the contrast of the individual layers. But the reason I make this point is that when we're talking about something like split toning, it's to do with in the film world, it's to do with the speed of our individual layers, of our red, green, and blue layers. So when we are thinking about, do I do my contrast first or my split first or vice versa, it's helpful to remember that in our sort of original reference, at least my original reference of a film system, there is no order to those things. They're just one thing. There's contrast on each layer that doesn't perfectly line up, which produces overall contrast as well as split toning. So that's kind of the cheeky broad answer that I think is helpful to keep in mind is ultimately we're trying to build one thing, right? We're just trying to build one thing, not two things. The way we can do that, we can actually run it both ways. We, funny enough, in early versions of Contour, we were doing split and then contrast. And then for a variety of reasons, the biggest one being wanting to get our divergence working properly finally, we ended up changing that around. So we're now doing contrast followed by split. So you can see if I zoom in on, let's make our waveform a little bit bigger here, and let's do a cheeky level of split toning for a minute. So you can see we've now got control over whether things come back together at the bottom, like so, or not. In order to produce this cleanly and without doing a bunch of color science acrobatics, we found that the best way to do it is actually to change the order. So now we do contrast followed by split. That was the first time I've ever really done it that way in my look development practice. It's been far more common for me to do split followed by contrast. But again, I think like the ultimate thing to understand is like, this is what matters. Like, this is what I'm looking for. It's really not about that order. It's about the overall curve shape. And this is a great example. Like, I wanted a curve shape in which the red stays disconnected from the green and the blue. In order to get that in a clean way, I found that the best way for me was to do contrast followed by split tone. Does that make sense? And we can do, yeah, if you guys have specific questions about contour, we can do a deep dive there. By the way, for any of my contour users, any contour users in the room, by the way? Put a hand up. Give a thumbs up, or I like this little icon for some reason. We're going to be doing an AMA on contour later this week, where we're going to be diving deeper into questions that have come up since we did our first look development in contour class late last year. So if you're a contour subscriber, make sure you check your email and join for that, which we're going to be doing later this week. What else we got?
All right. Question from Thatcher Freeman. Essentially, how to deal with colors that are out of the gamut or more saturated than the boundaries of Da Vinci white gamut? What's your approach for that?
This is a good question. How do we deal with out of gamut colors essentially and out of like scene gamut? I guess I would kind of like answer the question with a question. Like for you, Thatcher, have you encountered practical scenarios where you're like, oh gosh, I don't like the way this color is rendering on the screen, and it's not to do with it. The problem point is at the transform from camera space to working space using DaVinci Intermediate. I haven't really encountered that before. But it's a totally valid question because there's a large swath of color that's outside of DaVinci Intermediate completely. And I guess I'll caveat that slightly. I have encountered that in test conditions where we're looking at test images and images that have been gathered as sort of stress tests or like boundary tests for gamut and seeing like, oh, we're clipping on gamut and having problems there. In those situations, the like solution that we came up with at the time was to use the AP0 primary set, because AP0, as some of you guys may know, basically totally encloses, like, you all know the CIE triangle here. By the way, this is a bug I don't hear anyone talking about. When I go to one view on my scopes, I can't get back to two. If there happens to be some smart person in the room who's like, you dummy, this is the way you get back to that, then make my day and let me know, because I am stumped by this. But let's look at our CIE chromaticity chart. So ACES AP0, if I show this additional gamut here, ACES AP0 completely encloses the spectral locus, which is like the colors that human beings can see. So you can grade in AP0. By the way, this is not the space that is prescribed for grading by ACES. That's AP1, which is a good bit smaller. It's closer to like Rec 2020, closer actually to DaVinci Intermediate. Like if we compare AP1 to DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Wide Gamut's, at least the corners are a good bit bigger, but these being to go outside the color. So if we kind of focus back to Thatcher's question, he's talking about all this, all these, you know, like rich cyany greeny things happening over here. We can't get these in DaVinci Wide Gamut. Like I said, for me, in any practical scenario, I haven't run into a situation where like, oh, I'm losing color there that I can't get back and I don't like the way it's rendering. In test conditions, the only thing that I've been able to do is to move into a gamut more like AP0 that totally encloses everything. The problem with that is that when you're getting into a gamut that large, stuff feels weird. Like it's all about like context, but like trackballs and stuff like that, for example, like just feel odd to me in that space in a way that I've never really been able to overcome. So you could intuitively say like, oh, well, why not just grade in like the largest primary set possible? But for me, the practical reality I've found is like, it's just at a certain point, it becomes foreign. And maybe that's just a matter of context, but I'm going to totally butcher. I wonder if, I wish Joseph Slomko was here today. Joseph, you're not in the house, are you? He joins us sometimes, and I'm always really happy when he does. Joseph is one of my favorite color scientists in the world. He's the principal color scientist at Photochem. He's been on my podcast before. Super knowledgeable guy, but he gave me a great analogy that I'm not going to try to repeat right now because I'm going to totally butcher it. But the idea of it was he's like, look, operating in a working space that large is sort of like, I mean, I guess I am going to try to repeat it, but it was like, I think he was characterizing it as like, it's like, needing a map to show you how to get from your apartment to the coffee shop down the street and someone having to point it out to you on a map of the state of California. It's like, you're going to have to draw really fine little pencil strokes in the exact right position. And if you're off by an inch, you're actually talking about the wrong city completely. It's like, it just becomes challenging to perform operations for a destination display gamut that's ultimately going to be so much smaller than the operational gamut that you are doing your work in. I don't know if I answered any questions there, but in keeping with a grade school theme, I might not have answered the question, but maybe I brought up 5 other interesting questions.
Just a quick tip, to have 2 scopes at the same time, you simply have to make the window a little bit bigger.
Well, see, check this out though, because I did have 2 scopes at the same time, but once I tap from 2 to 1, I can't go back to 2 without resetting my UI layout or referring back to a saved UI, saved preset, which I actually don't have on the system right now.
Try to make it a little bit bigger manually, and then probably and hopefully you will have 2 scopes again.
Hey, is that a Rafa original tip, or did that come from the room?
I think everyone was testing it when you said that in the stream.
Hey, this should be like a type of grade school. I want to come to grade school and ask you guys all of my questions, and we'll see how many we can solve. This is huge. I'm going to be riding on this all week. This is rad. I literally always have to reset my UI layout when I do this. I'm like, why won't this go back? Amazing.
All right. Let's go to a more regular question then. And let's pick a good one because we don't have a lot of time. So let's talk about dealing with pure blacks values when at the timeline level you have some kind of adjustment that lifts the black a little bit up. What's your workflow essentially when tackling blacks at the clip level?
Oh, tackling clips at the tackling blacks at the clip level when you have something at the timeline level that's already lifting blacks. What's your approach there? Am I understanding that right, Raf?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this is a great one. And like, it's funny you guys ask. Like, I feel like every time we're in grade school, there's always at least a few questions that come up where I'm like, yeah, I was just thinking about that. So I'll be honest with you. This is something like this exact topic. That's something that like I'm not going to say stressed over, but it's like been a big preoccupation in my mind for a long time of like, oh, if I'm already lifting my black point, should I be lifting it again at my clip level, or how should I be thinking about controlling or shaping black point and shadows at the clip level when I'm underneath a lifted black point at the timeline level? And I'll give you guys like the punchline that I've arrived at after thinking about it, I think way too much in the past. I don't think about it at all. Like, I set my black point where I creatively want it to be. So we can see like in this curve, we've got a black point that's at about 9%. So well off the floor. Let's turn off this ramp for now. And I set that where I want it to be, and then I don't think about it again, and it doesn't handcuff me or limit the way that I work at all when I'm grading at the individual shot level. So like, let's reset a couple things here. I will still, when I'm using my custom tools, which are a little bit different than what I'm going to do here in Resolve right now, but essentially, like, I have a grading tool that's like my primary workhorse grading tool for doing primary tonal adjustments that allows me to control a couple things. We can kind of close things out here. This is a good one to wrap on. It allows me to adjust contrast, similar to contrast pivot, but a little bit different. And it allows me to do a couple of other things as well. One of them would be like that volume curve, a version of that volume curve that I showed you guys earlier. But one of the other big ones is it has a low trim and a high trim that allows me to do, it's kind of like lift, but it's much more confined than lift. It's more along the lines of, if I grab a DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray preset here, it's more along the lines of something like this, where I'm just scooping the low end, and maybe even more limited than that. So something more like this, where I'm just like scooping it out. This is what I'm talking about, like in the past having kind of an aversion or an anxiety about it. It's like, oh, should I really be doing that if I'm already doing a version of that here at the timeline level? But where I've gotten to now is like, I don't think about it at all. I actually think like that's a big part of like the work of color grading, and it's something I see in images that I love from movies, from other colorists, in paintings for that matter. A big part of what we do is kind of like smearing or mushing our shadows into one place, so that there's not as much, there's not nearly as linear of like a down to true zero. We're really kind of lifting that zero, and then on shots where things might still be dropping lower than I perceptually or visually want them to go in that particular shot, I'll lift up that black point as well. And like I said, the image in my mind is almost like I'm like smearing, or it's almost like a lump of clay that I'm kind of like, I'm pushing it all together into one common place, so that shadows have like a lane that they're parked in, and it feels really good, and things are kind of being like gravitated toward that particular point. In this case, like roughly that kind of 9% black point that we established at the timeline level. And it's helpful to look at too, like we already looked at a grayscale ramp here today, but just to get one more in before we wrap here, let's look at our waveform. And where's my ramp at? Oh, that's right, I've got my, no, that's not it. Let's just make this taller. There we go. So like, it's really helpful to just observe like, what's the net of what I'm doing? Like, first of all, the net of my black point adjustment, a little bit less than you might think when you're looking at the full final output of things. And then when you're looking at the net of like, oh, scooping that up a little bit more, it's maybe not as significant as we think. Like the overall curve shape is sort of maintaining. So that's a helpful lens on like, and if you're compressing, it's going to be even more subtle. That's kind of a helpful lens on like why it's maybe not as big of a deal as it would intuitively feel like, to be like, why am I always pushing the blacks up? That's almost always what I'm doing when I'm color grading, to be honest with you, is like I'm setting a black point that's above zero, and then I very, very rarely will use like the control that I'm talking about in my custom grading plugin is called low trim. And on my low trims, they're almost always going positive. Like I can go negative, and I can essentially do like something, you know, like negative lift essentially, but more focused. So it would be, you know, doing something like this, but I almost never do. I might increase contrast in the middle section of the curve, but my low trim is almost always being left alone, or it's going up a little bit. Hope that makes sense. Okay, guys, that was a good session. Good to see y'all today. Thanks for hanging out with me. Glad to be getting back into our flow with grade school. It's been kind of an erratic start to 2025 in terms of regular flow for grade school, so I'm glad to be back with you guys. I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your week, and I'm going to see you again soon here on the channel, and we got lots of fun stuff coming up, so stay tuned. Take care, everybody.